Alrighty, so thank you for everybody for showing up today. This is the third of our Hispanic Heritage events for the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and Community Engagement, as well as the Mexican American Studies program and the Gender and Women's Studies as well. We are sponsoring this talk on this new book that just recently came out, Reverberations of Racial Violence, Critical Reflections on the History of the Border. And we have the two editors here, Sonia Hernandez and John Moran Gonzalez, who are we're going to be having a conversation. And just in case you don't know, my name is Christopher Carmona. I am the interim director of the Mexican American Studies program at UTRGV, as well as a member of Refusing to Forget, and the chair of the National Association of Chicano Studies, the House Focal Committee on Pre-K through 12 Education. And so I just want, so when we start talking about this book, which actually was released over the summer, but this is, I think, one of the first times we've actually had that conversation about what's in this book and everything, all the work that went into this book itself. So I'm going to go ahead and start here with introducing Dr. Sonia Hernandez, is a native of the Rio Grande Valley. She received her PhD in Latin American history from the University of Houston in 2006. Dr. Hernandez specializes in the intersections of gender and labor in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, Chicano history and modern Mexico. After working for then UT Pan Am for 8 years, she moved to College Station, where she currently works as Associate Professor of History at Texas A&M. She is the author of the award-winning Working Women in the Borderlands, and published by Texas A&M Press and Mujeres, Trabajo y Región Fronteriza. Her new book, For a Just and Better World in Engendering Anarchism in the Mexican Borderlands, 1900-1938, comes out in November through University of Illinois Press. This book is going to focus on a transnational network of labor activists, in great part sustained by the anarchist syndicalist Cartina Piña in Tampico. Her work has been funded by the Texas Council for the Humanities, Summerfield G. Roberts Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and most recently, the Fulbright Foundation. And she's currently working on a book project which re-examines the 1901 Gregorio Cortez incident from a transnational and gendered perspective. So this is Dr. Sonia Hernandez. We also have Dr. John Moran Gonzalez, who is the J. Frank Dobie Regents Professor of American and English Literature at University of Texas, Austin. He has earned his PhD in English and American literature from Stanford in 1998. He has published in American literature journals such as American Literature, American Literary History, Aztlán, a journal of Chicano Studies, Western American Literature, and 19th Century Contexts, and Symbolism, an international journal of critical aesthetics. He's the author of 2 books, Border Renaissance, the Texas Centennial and the Emergence of Mexican American Literature, from UT Press in 2009, and The Troubled Union, Expansionists and Imperatives in Post-Reconstruction American Novels, from Ohio State in 2010. He has co-edited the Cambridge History of Latino American Literature, which was selected as a 2018 Choice Outstanding Academic Title. He's currently the director of the Center for Mexican American Studies at UT Austin, and then sits on the board of directors for Humanities Texas. So these are our 2 guests. And just to kind of go over the basic, I guess, criteria, just to make sure to keep you guys muted while the presenters are talking. If you guys have questions, we are going to open this up to the audience to ask questions. You can enter them into the chat, and then we can go ahead and kind of call on that when time comes there. But to talk about the reverberations of racial violence, this book in particular, well, the subject that this book talks about, for me, goes back a long way, since it's something that directly affected my family. And It really was, I think it was somewhere around 1917, where my great grandfather had to take his family into Mexico for 2 years in the middle of the Mexican Revolution because the violence on the border was too bad, and he came back 2 years later. But our family was directly affected by what happened here, and I grew up hearing the stories of the Texas Rangers my whole life, Los Linches. And when I got old enough, and I really started to think about what these stories meant, and I went to try to look for in the history books about it, it wasn't anywhere. This is what started the, my goal, my research into this whole area. This is what happened here, because I knew that I grew up hearing these stories, and they weren't anywhere in any of the history books. I remember even way back in like 2006, I believe, I tried to Google Rinche, and it didn't even pop up as a term. It was not there. And so I've been doing this work for quite a while now. And this book itself is, amongst others, text as well, but this book really covers that era. Um, and of course, it has a lot of the major scholars who are who've done the work in this for years now. So I want to go ahead and start off with my series of questions. So I guess I want to open it up to either one of you, or whoever wants to. I guess we could start with Sonia and talk about why you wanted to do this book in particular.
Thank you for having us, Chris, and thanks for everyone for zooming in. Well, related to what you just shared, we wanted to honor the voices of not only the victims, but the descendants who still, carry those memories with them, those stories passed down from generation to generation. And so this is really the product of a longer conversation. Let me rephrase, a longer public conversation that that was taking place even before that conference that we organized in Austin back in 2019, that took the centennial of the very first state-led investigation into Texas Ranger violence, called by the lone Mexican-American state legislator, Jose Tomas Canales, better known as JT Canales. And as a way to sort of reflect upon this dark chapter in our state's history and our country's history, but also in a way that honored those memories that you just shared. And so we wanted to do it with respect and with dignity, and also to show the larger public that, these were not, isolated acts of violence. I mean, this was violence that was pretty widespread, particularly after 1914, 1915. And that was, that was part of a larger project. I think it's really important to give the context here that, it's not like, here is 1910 and there are Mexican Americans and Mexican people being killed at the hands of state agents. This is part of what, these larger developments that historians have written about, calling this period the progressive era. Some historians have actually called it the repressive era, which coincides with this Porfirian Mexican vision of order and progress, which called for modernization, industrialization, at the expense of the bulk of the Mexican origin population who would come to perform that labor in order to fulfill those visions. And so, there's this larger, process that we could call perhaps the racialization of Mexicans and Mexican Americans, to the point where by the time that you get to the Mexican Revolution 1910, and certainly by the time that the US enters the Great War or World War I, there's this great anxiety over quote, suspected Mexican bandits, suspected revolutionaries, fear that violence would spill over to this side. And so that then creates sort of the perfect moment, or the perfect storm, if you will, to then carry out these indiscriminate acts of violence. I'll leave it at that for now. I'm sure we'll get back to some of these things. But so going back to your question, we wanted to do it in a way that honored those memories, and also to show the larger public that there is evidence, that there's all kinds of evidence that supports this history of this dark chapter in our state's history, particularly if one looks at the 3 volumes that are the Canales hearings.
Thank you, Sonia. So I guess to kind of look at, to turn to John to kind of look at, since we are, I guess, the 2 that are not the quote unquote professional historians on the team, to talk about what was your interest in doing this work and doing this book. You're on mute, John. Let's see.
I can't hear you, John.
Yeah, you got to unmute. Let's see. Oh, thank you. Let's see.
John, can you hear me? Can you unmute?
Oh,
I think we're getting some.
how's that?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
How's that?
Yeah. Yes.
Great. Okay, sorry about the technical difficulties, danger with Zoom. But in any case, I'd like to thank Chris and, of course, the audience for coming out tonight. And I'd also just like to add to what Sonia mentioned, and that is my sense, my interest really in this was, one, in how it got reflected and refracted in the cultural expressions of Mexican and Mexican Americans in the decades to come. There's a refraction in expressive culture about this moment, and it was such a key moment that people are writing about it decades later. And also the fact that this is a story of modernity, right? This is a story where, it's not like progress, Anglo progress comes to the valley and makes things better. Instead, rather, state violence and modernity are mutually constitutive, right? They're part and parcel of the process of the modernization, as it were, of the valley. And so violence is an intimate and necessary, and it becomes a necessary part of it as it meets resistance in the form of Mexican Americans and other Mexican descent people resisting the impositions of modernity. So I think those are really my interests in this story.
Definitely. I think that, when we're looking at this subject area, and certainly its undertelling in American history, or in a lot of people, even like the younger generations and students that I talk to, don't know about this history at all. And people from the Valley, it has, for a long time, if you did not have a direct link to the people that were involved, they just didn't know about it. And so I think that this is one of the, to get this out there, get these stories out there, for me, is extremely important. And as John was saying, how it has affected, the culturally. So I guess I'm going to go back to how this book got started. If you guys, one of you guys want to talk about the Refusing to Forget project itself.
It's kind of hard to see if you're about to start to, speaking, John, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, this is, gosh, going back to 2013, 2014. So, John, Dr. Monica Munoz Martinez, Dr. Trini Gonzalez, Dr. Ben Johnson, and very soon Dr. Christopher Carmona. We came together and we talked about how to commemorate. There's a series of sort of centennials that were coming up. The centennial of the Mexican Revolution had passed. We actually, when I was at then UT Pan American, we had organized a conference to mark the centennial of the Mexican Revolution. I know Dr. Gonzalez and Dr. Johnson were there and participated. And so some of us had, we had started this conversation talking about this period of violence. But it was in 2013 that we came together, and Dr. Munoz Martinez invited the Alvarados, who were, a family from West Texas, with a direct connection to the horrible Porvenir massacre that occurred in 2018, which prompted the Canales investigation that took place in early 1919. And so we wanted to mark these centennials and these moments, historical moments, in a way that honored the voices and the memories of the descendants. And so it was I mean, at least for me, for Dr. Munoz Martinez, she had been working for quite a bit of time with the Alvarados and with other families, and this is reflected in her path-breaking book, The Injustice Never Leaves You, published in 2018 or 2019, but recently published. And so it was just wonderful that Monica had established a relationship with these families who were generous enough to share their family archives. And so we listened to them, and we wanted to organize a series of events. We talked also about, historical markers, the need to share this history with, the widest audience possible. And it was, that was a great first conversation that we had, and that happened at a Knox Tejas conference in San Antonio. And so that then became a much bigger thing, and we're still here. It's 2021, and Refusing to Forget is still here. And so we are, a public history project that is focused on recovering and, sharing, preserving this history, which, mostly focuses on the 1910-1920 period. But having focused in this specific period has also given us the opportunity to work with other community members and other shareholders, educators, students, and using those events as a learning, as a teaching moment, as a learning opportunity, but to do it in a way that did not promote just a simple victimization. We wanted to do it with, of course, with honor and respect and dignity, but we also wanted to show the great resilience on the part of the Mexican and Mexican American community. Resiliency that was shown through, the courageous act of J.T. Canales risking his personal life and his partner too, Ann Wheeler Canales, because he was, publicly charging the Rangers with acts of violence. So, it then became much more, and now we're working on, curricular lessons, right? Helping educators, and now, my goodness, ever so important with everything that we are experiencing with attacks on our history. Getting historical markers installed to mark the sites where some of these massacres occurred, but also honoring civil rights activists that stood up in defense of the Mexican American community, like Jovita Hidar, and that was also part of one of the things that we did as Refusing to Forget out in Webb County.
Thank you.
So if I could add, one thing to remember is that the history of the commemoration of public events of history in the United States has been largely one of the commemoration of white supremacy. And so the part of our strategy in doing this, that is on capitalizing upon the centennials of these events, was, and to apply for historical markers, was to, as it were, co-opt that strategy, right? These moments they're important moments, right? They're for critical reflection upon not only these specific events, right, and to honor those who were affected directly and their descendants, but also in national, where, you know, okay, you know, let's out as far as and memorializations for people of color and for Mexican Americans and Mexican descent people more specifically. The other resonance that I think we had when we were forming Refusing to Forget, the almost daily people of color, mainly African Americans. So this is Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, and a whole number of other folks, where the questions that we examined in this period for Mexican Americans, the problems of police brutality and the misuse of state violence were absolutely, of a piece. Right? It wasn't like, oh, there was some dead past that we were seeking to revive. No, we're living it. And so it was part of the project to, once again, highlight that there is a kind of problem with policing, right? Both then and now. I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. So I think that, the Refusing to Forget, even though the scope has mostly focused on this period, has spread out into all these different areas. And especially now, I'm looking at what's been going on with, police brutality. But certainly when we start to look at this movement right now, this anti-ethnic studies movement, and, I guess we can to kind of talk about why you think it's important that this book, or learning this kind of history is important in this type of era where we have a huge resurgence of, anti-critical race theory, anti-ethnic studies. So, I wonder if you want to go ahead and talk about why you guys think it's important to tell these stories.
Okay, Chris, I'll go ahead and jump in, but you'll have to give me audio clues because my video is not working.
All right,
so
that's fine.
But to answer the question, first, there's been a conflation, right, that between critical race theory as it is understood within kind of legal circles, right? It's a very, very specific kind of approach. But of course, it is only it's only one aspect, as it were, of the way one might call critical race studies has kind of been adopted widely across multiple disciplines in the humanities and some social sciences. So conflation aside, though, I think the question is, there's no doubt that this is in reaction, from the right wing to what went on with the protests over George Floyd's murder at the hands of the police. And there you had a scenario of, well, wow, even, a lot of people, including a lot of white people, have finally acknowledged that policing, this kind of policing is out of control and a huge problem for everybody. So, however, there are others who don't think that, and hence the attempt to legislate it away.
Thank you, John. Sonia, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, thank you for that, John. I want to, and I agree with your comments. But let's also take it down to the border, what we're seeing now. And we're seeing this sort of dangerous rhetoric about casting particular immigrants in a certain way, where they're almost sort of reduced to subhuman. And so this is dangerous rhetoric that circulated at the turn of the 20th century. We can also even go back further back to say the years leading up to the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example. And so that kind of rhetoric is very dangerous. And so to your, going back to your question about why it's important to know this history, it's even if it sounds sort of cliche-ish, but we should take it as a lesson, right? And to try to really understand how dangerous rhetoric can lead to violence and to even death for many. And so this is something that we really need to be concerned with. And it, I think you have a question about, the recent attacks on Mexican American studies and also just on anything critical, critical history. But it really upsets me because we are doing a disservice to our young people. And I mean, some of us are lucky because now we're familiar with this history. But if we don't do something about these recent attacks to silence and censor teachers in the public schools, and we are handicapping them, but that also translates to the uneducating, the process of uneducating a whole generation. And we're barely sort of scratching the surface in terms of recovering and excavating these histories for a long, long time. And so now we're dealing with this. And so it's a very concerning thing. And it's something that we need to, face head on and try to find ways to continue preserving this history and learning from it.
Yes, definitely. I think that, when we're looking at also this history in itself, the way that, I got access to this history was not, I think it survived in different ways. And one of them is obviously through the artwork, right? The corridos, the stories that were told, the Medical Paredes with his pistol in his hand, and others who came out and wrote about this, but so I wanted to go ahead and ask, because I'm going to turn this to John here, about framing the collection with two poems, and the two poems that you chose. If you want to go ahead and talk about that, John.
Well, it was really important, I think, for us to do that because for a long time, right, Mexican Americans and Mexican descent people were essentially of academia, at least the higher echelons, right, of the PhD and of the tenured academic historian who could then write these stories. So for the longest time, what there was no, as it were, academically sanctioned narrative of these events. Now, of course, there's always been community based renditions, right? And it found itself into corridos. It found its way into novels like the opening of George Washington Gomez by Américo Paredes, right? There's the whole section called Los Deliciosos. And in other kind of creative music, in song, in literature, and in poetry. So really, so it was a reminder that, that is bookending with the two poems. It was a reminder that these histories, the official academic, histories that we are now in a position to be able to begin to write, have always been, as it were, in conversation and through the kind of expressive cultural traditions that our communities have. And so having the poems like that, which were kind of, they're new poems, right? They're really recent poems, really was a reminder of how these events viscerally affect us today and our communities today. And so, we felt that it was just, a must to include that acknowledgement that academics, even Mexican-American academics, are not the only ones who have told this history.
Yes, thank you for that, John. And I think that goes to, especially when doing work in this field, and particularly this subject area, a lot of when I was working on, trying to work for my books, a lot of the history I got was really not from textbooks. It was from oral histories, from people telling me their stories. And what's, one of the things I found interesting when I was doing this research, and then when we finally got access to the Canales hearings, the transcript, with a lot of these stories were almost verbatim what was in those testimonies. And that just goes to show you that, usually when you're doing oral history type work, you're going to get some embellishment, or some things are going to be different. But I was surprised to see how they were almost, 100 years later, they're the same stories with the same details. It really shows how these things were seared into the memories of these descendants and the people who were affected by this. So I wanted to go ahead and ask about really the I guess the conversation or the debate about written documentation over oral history, and why these histories are, how do you think these histories would benefit, they benefit more from looking at oral histories, and why that should be taken more seriously, I think. And you do a lot of that work in this collection. But if you want to go ahead and I guess for Sonia, if you want to go and talk about that.
No, thank you for that question, Chris. I think this is an example, the anthology is an example of how that is slowly beginning to change, at least in my discipline in history. I can't tell you enough, right, how many times I still hear colleagues, particularly senior colleagues, who, they still feel uncomfortable with students using oral histories. This is, and a lot of it has to do with at least within academia, what we tend to describe as legitimate research. So oftentimes oral history is seen as, it's a touchy-feely, culturally, it's not academically rigorous, but it is. It is, and this anthology is so much better because those oral histories were able to get in, and this is like throughout the anthology. So I think that is slowly changing. But we also have a responsibility, those of us who are in academia, to change that narrative, and we have to stand up for colleagues who submit work as part of their dossier that includes oral histories. And, you know, we're like the gatekeepers. And we also have to also get on those, you know, editorial boards of journals and talk to our colleagues about the importance of oral history. I think, again, we've made some progress, at least in the discipline of history, but we still have a ways to go.
For sure. And I think, you know, kind of to talk about one of the things that shows the importance of doing this kind of work and the importance of, you know, interviewing these people, these descendants who have, you know, for me, I don't know if it was because, you know, well, I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that, you know, our families were Cavazos who were directly affected by this. But a lot of the people opened up to me and told me their stories, right? And these stories that they've been carrying around, and I guess nobody had really asked them about this, you know, in a long time. But one of the things that especially when I was doing a presentation a few years ago at a high school, there was a student that came up to me afterwards, and he asked me if I knew who Ana Santapazania was. And Ana Santapazania, for those who don't know who that is in the audience, was a revolutionary who fought against the Texas Rangers during this time. And he was a landowner who lost his land to what was happening here. And of course, his son got shot and his family was attacked, which led him to become, you know, what they call the bandit, right? But he asked me, and I said, yeah, I know who he is. He said, that was my great grandfather. And that since that time, you know, their family, he was the first one to go to college since, you know, because they lost all their wealth after that attack. And, you know, his great grandfather is, you know, because of he's considered a quote unquote a criminal, is not allowed to be buried in Brownsville, where he's from. So he's buried in Matamoros. And but he said that because, you know, of all this, their entire family was completely decimated from what happened during that time. And it's really his generation now who's going back and trying to reclaim that. So we're talking about 4 or 5 generations of people who are still affected by what happened here. And it's not that long ago. And so, you know, hearing just his story about the fact that, you know, that I knew who his great grandfather was, you know, and that he got to talk to me about it, really opened up a lot for him, right? Because he hadn't been able to talk about, you know, because he's often gets called a bandit and all these different things. But so I think that kind of work and bringing these stories out brings a lot of this, and, you know, for people that are, you know, affecting people nowadays. But yeah, so I mean, for me, that's when we start looking at how these stories are told and why they're important. So before we go to look to see if the audience has any questions, I want to see if Sonia or John want to say something about, I guess both of you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, I also wanted to point out how this violence was very gendered, and the response to the violence as well. So part of the larger effort to modernize and industrialize the region involved, you know, particular gender ideas about, you know, the kind, at least to promote capital investments and to prime the borderlands for further, even more further investments. It also involved a gender discourse that dictated which kinds of jobs women could do that were morally safe. But that also translates to, as you were just pointing out, to this, you know, so-called bandit rhetoric, that it also is very gendered. In you know, number one, it also applied to men, and almost, you know, describing you know, these quote Mexican bandidos as greasers, and dehumanizing them, and almost sort of like robbing them of their masculinity. And for women, anybody who stood up and, you know, transgressed those boundaries of, you know, normative gendered behavior, those women were often labeled as, you know, public women, mujeres de la calle, and, you know, cast as immoral women. And so this is, also part of the larger rhetoric here that was, that would help to sort of solidify the idea of Mexican and Mexican American people as, only good for labor, cheap disposable labor.
Yeah, I would add, I think one of the most exciting things about doing this work are these kind of new avenues of thinking about it that really, really have aspect has been the gendered aspect that Sonia alluded to. The other has been the ecological. And that's the kind of avenue I'm interested in. It really has been one in which, you have to imagine this moment as being an ecological catastrophe for the environment of the valley. So I'll go ahead and leave it at that for the moment and hope to have more questions about it.
So yeah, I want to go ahead and turn it over to the audience to see if you guys have any questions for the editors. And so you can either type them into the chat or you can just go ahead and chime in if you guys have questions or comments.
And Chris, maybe we can also share the link to the UT Press book site, so people can see the table of contents.
Sure. Let's see here. Let me find it real quick. So, well. All right. So I guess let's see if we have any questions coming in. Yeah, so one thing we can mention right now, if you guys want to talk about, well, one of the things is both I think Monica's book came out in 2018 because both our books came out at the exact same time when we had the dual release. But all of, if not a lot of Monica's work is based on the oral histories that she took from all these families, and so I went ahead and put that in there in the chat there, so you guys can kind of take a look at what we're talking about, and let me go ahead and open this up here. So this book, yes. So, all right. So we have if you want to go ahead and share your question, Brett, you can go ahead and just ask it out. Or just want to go ahead.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I was just asked, what directions would the two of you like to see the scholarship on the racist violence of the early 20th century head in the coming decades? What are some of the avenues that you think that research is going to head?
Hi, Brent. Good to see you virtually. Thanks for the question. So as someone trained as a Latin Americanist, sort of always looking at both sides, and a personal interest of mine, I would like to see comparative work between, say, agencies like the Texas Rangers and the Mexican Rurales. So there's a lot going on throughout Mexico, but particularly in the northern part, as a way to keep Diaz in power. So there are a lot of, I've seen going back to Chris's question about oral histories, I've heard people talk about acts of violence on the part of the Rurales, but I've also seen archival documentation pointing to that violence. So that would be one. The other would be also sort of comparative in nature also, but from a gendered perspective. So looking at, for example, women like Jovita Idar, who was an anti-lynching activist in her own right, and examining perhaps her relationships with other anti-lynching female activists at the time. yeah, whether, you're talking about African-American women who were involved in the anti-lynching movement or Anglo-American women, but kind of looking at that sort of gendered avenue, if you will, of state violence.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think I can elaborate on the ecological dimension that I previously mentioned, and really in a kind of transnational way, because of course the kind of ecological habitats don't end at the river. In fact, if anything, they go outward from it. And so when you're looking at kind of comparative histories of habitats north and south of the Rio Bravo, right? You get, they're similar at some level, right? In that there are major changes, destruction of huge amounts of what had previously been there. And I'm not talking about a kind of pristine order of nature, because of course, wherever there are people, there are changes, right? But I'm talking about on a kind of industrial mechanized scale, which radically alters the landscape, so that, Tamaulipan thorn scrub landscape is transformed into a kind of commercial agricultural kind of paradigm. The North Bank, and to a lesser degree in redistribution. So there are different stories about how the U.S. and Mexico kind of approach the modernization of the habitat. And it's one that in which there have been some writers like Arturo Longoria, who have developed a kind of ecologically based transnational community consciousness, right? So it's kind of like Américo Paredes' notion of Greater Mexico, right? That is a whole transnational community of Mexicanos. But unlike Paredes' very culture-based one, Longoria is very much tied to the ecological habitat of the Tamaulipan thorn scrub, and doesn't go in. Let's present our different ways of thinking through the transnational, right, in this comparative context that's
Thank you, John. So, I think that, unless we have any more questions right now, but I just wanted to say that this information in this book, and I think that, even this history is extremely important, and obviously not just at the university level, but at the public school level as well, right? Where, I mean, by reaching the younger kids to know about their own histories, right, from the get-go. And I think that it's not, I mean, even though Texas is in the spotlight for this right now, it is really a national wide effort to kind of curb what we consider to be like, this teaching of ethnic studies, which over the past few years, decade or so, has gained a lot of traction. And it's producing people who are challenging the status quos of what we think about the politics, right? And I think that, obviously this past election really showed, I mean, that the population is more engaged now because they're becoming more educated. Yet we are still very much at the beginning of this struggle. I mean, of educating a lot of people. It is something that there's a fear of people learning their histories, and I think that is something that we should learn as everybody should learn their histories, because the histories are, when learning through our history, we learn who we are, right? As people, if we keep on living off of myths, we end up really doing a disservice to all the peoples out there and everybody's stories. And so I think that, with looking at this area in particular, and part of the work that I do too is to get these stories out there, because every time when I talk to different kids and things, there is a connection that is made. There is a light that kind of goes off, that their history matters, right? And their stories matters, and that the stories that their grandparents told them, that told me, are important. And so I just wanted to go ahead and say that before. I know I just want to ask, like I said, Sonia and John, if they want to say one last thing before we go, for tonight, or unless we have one more question or not. Or no, go ahead, Sonia.
I agree with you, Chris. I mean, I think we are at a critical juncture, and this kind of history, and I agree with the chat, the individual who made that comment about this has to be also in our public school system, and it's absolutely critical. And this is, there is no harm in teaching that. Teaching that we can talk and have civil conversations with people who are different than us. That is, a very important lesson. And what's happening is that difference is being cast as not part of the long history of this country. And anything that resembles, critical inquiry of any historical moment, any historical era, is bad, and that it's disloyal behavior or unpatriotic. And I would say, one of the most patriotic things that one can do is to always want to improve our communities. And how do we do that? By learning more about them, and by trying to broaden the historical narrative and include as many voices as possible. And yes, of course, there are moments of conflict, but there's also moments of cooperation, collaboration. I mean, that's also in the anthology. That's one of the first chapters that addresses sort of the various cultures in Texas at the time during the Canales hearings. And it's okay to teach our kids that there were these moments that were pretty dark, but you use them as a lesson, a tool to learn more, and to help our young people think critically. So hopefully everyone will find the anthology worthwhile, significant piece of scholarship, and I know that it was a collaborative effort with the memory, keeping the memory of the descendants and those victims at the center of the conversation.
Well, Chris, I mean, I'd like to thank you, and I know Dr. Trinity Gonzalez is on the Zoom as well. I mean, and many, many others for all your work for getting Mexican American studies approved, curriculum approved for the K through 12 level. I mean, as Sonia has already said, this is a crucial avenue of importance. But I think it's also instructive that we have a great chapter by Dr. Carlos Blanton and Dr. Phyllis Barragan Getz on the state of schooling of Mexican and Mexican origin children at that time. And really, as you can imagine, the public schools were pretty awful, and for all kinds of reasons. But Mexican origin communities also decided on an alternative strategy of escuelitas. And so, even as we, put effort into kind of, making sure the public schools system acknowledges, overwhelmingly more than 50% student age population, it may also require ensuring we have other venues, right? And I'm not saying we need to recreate Escuelitas, right? But I mean, there are other venues, including, on social media, in part serve to this end. So I think absolutely, thanks to everybody thinking about the alternatives as well.
Well, thank you, John. I just want to go ahead and invite Annette Portillo. I don't know if the question was directed at me or at the group. If you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. And I really appreciate this book and the discussion. And I just wondered how Indigenous history and culture, especially as it relates to genocide of Indigenous people on the borderlands, become a part of the larger narrative of violence that you are talking about, with specific attention to the oral histories by Indigenous people, either perhaps erased or silenced or told in this venue.
If I might begin to answer that question, I think this is an incredibly crucial question. Because of course, one of the dangers is that to kind of think that this violence was only in the past, right? That it's not an ongoing kind of issue for Native communities in South Texas. Of course it is. And so one aspect that I'm thinking about in, thinking through the kind of, as it were, an ecological kind of lens for this work would be precisely to consult with Indigenous communities today, right, for their oral histories about this transformation and this process. I have to admit I'm at the beginning stages of this, but nonetheless, I think your question points to the kind of reminder, for us in Mexican American studies that this is Indian country too. So yeah.
I absolutely agree with you, John. And I would also, point to the long, brutal history of, eliminating, handling the Indigenous communities of Texas on the part of the Texas Rangers. Just like the brutal history with respect to the African American community. And of course, we've been talking about the ethnic Mexican community, but, we could also talk about the brutal treatment of even, white labor radicals who were also, hunted by the Texas Rangers. So it's certainly a voice and a history that we need to be mindful of, and that forms part of this very dark history, and still, has, as the book title suggests, still has reverberations to this day.
Thank you, Annette, for your question. And I think that, also to recognize that we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of what they call the Second Battle of Wounded Knee, where the Oglala Nation were fighting for, against corruption back in the 70s. And, with Russell Means, Dennis Banks, and Anna Quash, and all these different activists, that's also a history of the FBI, right? And their brutality against the Native populations. Yeah. So I think that, I think that that's one of those things that I think definitely needs to be considered when we're talking about these things. I think we do have a question here from Noreen. I don't know if you want me to read it out, or.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, Noreen.
Okay, my internet's a bit sketchy, but I'll go ahead and read it. So the lower Rio Grande Valley, as we all know, remains one of the poorest communities in the nation, especially during the COVID era, which We have a 17% rate of unemployment right now, which is startling. Can John and Sonia, thank you so much for being here. Can you please speak more about the matanza and early 20th century racial violence against Mexicans in South Texas as a financial catastrophe for Mexicanos and their descendants? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Noreen, and it's good to hear you. And thanks for your contribution to the anthology. No, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about landed people who were killed at the hands of the Rangers during La Matanza, you know, or the slaughter. This is a term that appears in Spanish language newspapers. And you're also talking about even those who were fortunate enough to escape that violence and fled to Mexico, mind you, during a revolution, one of the bloodiest revolutions of the 20th century, probably even more or bloodier than the Chinese Revolution, and up there with the Russian Revolution. And so you're talking about people who left their property to flee violence. So that's another, you know, that's another thing to consider. And then also just a whole labor force, because you're also talking about working class people who were performing the labor out in ranches, who would then form the bulk of the labor force during this transition from ranching to commercial agriculture. So absolutely, there's a financial loss here. There's a financial dimension that oftentimes sort of slips through the cracks and doesn't get enough attention. No, thanks for bringing that up. I'll pass it on to John.
Yeah, I'll just add that, in fact, that the kind of loss of an economic base, you know, power essentially for this group had consequences in other arenas too, socially, politically, and so on, right? So it wasn't simply a decline in economic power. It was a decline in political power, it's a decline in social power, and therefore less of an ability to counteract the kind of Juan Crow type segregation policies that were getting implemented. You know, in the border towns, there was, you know, relative degree of success in holding some of the worst parts off, but, you know, definitely in the rural areas, you know, it got full blown.
Thank you, Noreen, for that question. And yeah, so Noreen does have the opening poem in this book, which is it's a great little poem there. But yeah, unless if we have any more questions, or if not, all right. Well, then I just want to thank both of the editors of this collection, Reverberations of Violence. This is a really good book, and I hope you guys can pick it up and, you know, use the material in here, because a lot of everything in here is extremely important to understand about what's you know, where we are today in a lot of ways. I mean, we just saw those photos not too long ago about the Border Patrol on horseback. And that brought back for me memories of these photos of the Rangers, and, you know, the very famous one where they have them, like, you know, rustled up like cattle, right? So I think we do have a question. If you want to go ahead and ask your question, Yvonne.
I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah, we can see you.
Okay, great. So basically, I just want to thank Miss Hernandez. You know, both presenters, you guys are honestly, your book and your topics and what you focus on is basically one of the sole reasons why I decided to get into Mexican American Studies, and why I hope to one day be an immigration and civil rights attorney. I'm getting my master's right now at UTRGV, and then I'm heading over to law school. So I just want to thank you guys. The fact that this scholarship revolves around minorities that are often disregarded at a federal, state, and local level. We've learned so much, and I feel like there's still so much scholarship that is left unnoticed and unread and unrecognized. And I cannot wait until this scholarship is implemented more within school curriculums and eventually all over the country, and who knows, even around the world, as more individuals start realizing the realities behind the American history that has often been disregarded, voices unheard of. I want them to know that we're not just a minority. We're a huge part of American history, and we should be recognized as so. So yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Your words mean a lot to me, and I'm sure you will do great in law school and be a great lawyer. I'll say that you're at a good place. I'm a proud Bronc, back when it was called UT Pan American, and I'll still call it UT Pan American. But no, thanks for the vote of confidence.
Yes, thank you. We hope to reach a wide audience and to hopefully even inspire people that way, and and also to the sense that this is getting more recognition as an incredibly important aspect of academic scholarship, right? We're fortunate, as was mentioned, I think in the chat earlier, that Dr. Monica Munoz Martinez just received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, which is for her work on this topic, right? So slowly, there's more recognition. Hopefully, the momentum will continue.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a great panel, and I want to go ahead and thank the editors and for being on here, and for the audience for coming out tonight. And I just want to let you know that there will be this will be on YouTube, so I will be putting it up probably tomorrow and sharing it through all of our sources, and then I guess we'll have it up on the Refusing to Forget website when we figure that out tomorrow. But
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to UTRGV Mas. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.
Bye. See you guys tomorrow.